There is a condition known as Gunter's disease. Congenital erythropoietic porphyria.
I'm familiar with porphyria. It's probably ignorance of porphyria as a disease that led to the creation of vampire myths in Asia in the Middle Ages.
You are really upsetting me. On several levels.
Hello, and welcome to Discovering the X-Files, the podcast in which a newbie takes a deep dive into the entirety of Chris Carter's universe, while longtime fans escort me on the journey, a perilous journey filled with government conspiracies or weird monsters every other week. I'm Erix Antoine, and today Daniel and I will be discussing 3, which originally aired on November 4th, 1994. It was written by Chris Rupenthal and Glenn Morgan and James Wong, and directed by David Nutter. In this episode, the X-Files department has been reopened, but Mulder is still on his own following Scully's disappearance. He investigates a series of ritualistic murders in Los Angeles, which he believes to be the work of a cult. He's not entirely incorrect, except it turns out to be a cult of vampires. And he gets romantically involved with a beautiful woman who wants to maybe join this cult. It's a fantastical Monster of the Week episode, and the first one to not feature Gillian Anderson in any capacity. After the break, Daniel and I are going to break it down. Stick around.
You know what we are.
What are you?
He is the Father, I am the Son, and she is the unholy Spirit.
And the 3 of you killed Garrett Laurie.
No.
Your fingerprints were found at the crime scene.
No. When a snake eats a fly, it's not murder. It just is.
Frogs eat flies.
Look, what nobody realizes is that there is no afterlife. I know this, but listen to me. I know this because when we prolong our lives by taking theirs, all I see is such horror in their eyes. And that's because at that moment, they're face to face with death. And then suddenly they realize there's nothing else. There's no heaven. There's no soul. It's just rot and it's just decay. And I will never, ever, ever, ever have to face that.
So, okay, I thought it was kind of interesting how earlier, last season, there was the episode Eve, which, kind of started out with like a bait and switch, where, they gave the impression that this was going to be an X-Files vampire episode, right? Eve. Yeah. And then, had nothing to do, not even remotely, had nothing to do with vampires whatsoever. And then, we've already had a werewolf episode. And you and I discussed how that's kind of our speed. Like we like werewolf lore. We enjoy werewolf horror movies and so on. And so now finally, here is an actual vampire episode. And for the listeners, our friend Daniel is wearing a Castlevania T-shirt, which I'm wondering if this was is it just a coincidence?
It's a coincidence.
Okay, well, but anyway, so here we have a vampire episode, and I have some mixed feelings about it overall. But I do think that it is very much an X-Files vampire episode, and I do think that they do some interesting things with it. But I'd like you to go first here because I think you asked for this episode.
I did.
Specifically.
I did.
You really wanted to talk about this one, so I want to hear your thoughts.
I think it's an interesting one, made more interesting by the fact that it comes in the wake of Scully's disappearance and in the wake of the reopening of the X-Files. So you've got a moody and somber Mulder rolling around in a vampire movie of the week. So it kind of it fits the tone of it in general. I mean, you get that really quiet sequence at the start of him, pulling the plastic off of everything in his office, and he's actually created an X file for Scully, and he's put some of her stuff in it, and he just kind of defeatedly sticks it in the filing cabinet, and then his phone rings, and off to the races on a case that apparently he had just been keeping track of, even while he was, doing his listening.
Yeah, his surveillance, his surveillance of mobster phone calls.
Yeah, and transcribing them.
Yeah, clearly he was following the case because it very much is an X-file, clearly. You're right, like that the opening scene was probably, here's the weird thing, it was probably my favorite scene of the episode. It was this really, because it was very evocative. I liked how they were picking it up from the plot line of now, Scully has disappeared. And I just thought it was a very nice, evocative scene. Like I like that, I like that they're not, we know that there are reasons behind the scenes for Scully not to be there, right? So I like that they're giving this its proper weight in the storyline, in like the, in the character development. So that's good that they actually acknowledge that and they put some focus on it. That it's not just a Monster of the Week episode where Scully just isn't there and they don't acknowledge it or talk about it or anything. They take a moment to acknowledge that. And this we've said about that one of the great qualities of the show is Duchovny and David Duchovny and Gillian Anderson's chemistry, Mulder and Scully working together. That's a big thing for the show. And so far, we've seen basically, I mean, they're separated, and you have seen a lot of Mulder on his own, even though Scully's been there in the background, even if it's just for one scene, talking to him over the phone. But we have seen Mulder basically working on his own, all these cases. And we've seen how it's always good to have Mulder playing off of someone, right?
Yeah.
So they have given him these partners, temporary partners for each episode, whether it's, somebody that's there or Krychek or whoever. But the point is he's always had someone to play off of. And in this episode, he doesn't really have that. And I think that's noticeable, and I think that's potentially a problem. In this one, it is just him. It's him flying solo. And like in that very first scene, you think maybe that cop that's he's at the mansion where the guy is killed at the beginning. Mm-hmm. And you think maybe that's going to be this week's cop, this week's partner for Mulder. But no, he's like, nope, I work alone.
Mm-hmm.
You go like, okay, so he is flying solo. And him not having that, someone to like bounce off of, I guess it's compensated by the fact that he's given a love interest.
Yes.
Kind of tacked on love interest, but a love interest nonetheless, played by Perry Reeves. I think that's how you pronounce her name, Perry Reeves, who was Duchovny's girlfriend at the time that they shot the episode. Yeah. So I guess he had already broken up with Maggie Wheeler, who had shown up a few weeks earlier. But yeah. So I guess that's how they compensate for it. And it's a bit weird. It's a little bit to have all of a sudden Mulder as a very to get into the sexual aspect of Mulder, to give him a love interest and to do it. This is the second time we're seeing anything like that, because it was in the first season you had the episode Fire, which sort of hinted at that, a figure from his past that had more weight to it. Here you basically just have it's somebody he meets at a club. You know what I mean? It's it's a more standard sort of love interest of the week kind of thing.
Oh yeah.
And I don't know that works for the character.
I agree with you on a lot of that, and I think I'm willing to let it slide because it's not going to be an ongoing issue for the season.
Mm-hmm.
And he does have a little bit of he has some fun interaction with the coroner. There's a nice little back and forth going on there between them. I think when Mulder goes into his big diatribe about how he didn't think such a creature would actually exist. Of all the things he believes in, he did not believe in vampires. And just goes through it using medical jargon, making complete scientific sense to the doctor, and the doctor just looks back at him and says, "You are really upsetting me on several levels."
Yeah, you're right. It's like for that moment, he does become Scully.
Yeah.
You know, he's the Scully of that scenario who's like, all of the vampire lore can be explained away because of this and this and this and this. And by the way, vampire mythology probably exists because of people's misunderstanding of porphyria, right? That's it is funny how he becomes Scully at that, you know, in this episode, he gets to be the skeptic. And you go like, well, so you believe in werewolves, but you don't believe in vampires? When, I mean, vampires are almost more believable. You know, just the idea of somebody who will drink blood and that will somehow grant them special powers is a little bit more believable than a person's body physically transforming into an animal and then once again transforming into a human. I think so. Here's the thing about like the vampire, the way they handle it.
Mm-hmm.
See, at first, based on the way it starts, I really thought we were going to be looking at a vampire story that was going to be in the vein of like, you know, Martin or Vampire's Kiss, the Nicolas Cage movie, because where you modernize the lore in a certain way, but you really do treat it as more of this is a psychotic cult. This is a cult that commits these ritualistic murders, and they do drink blood and they do these things. And for maybe the first 15, 20 minutes of the episode, you sort of say to yourself, okay, well, that's what we're watching. And that, to me, as an idea, maybe it's lacking the paranormal aspect of an X-File, but I'm able to kind of follow it. I'm buying into it.
Right.
And then, you know, that guy burns up when the sun touches him, and then you go, oh, okay. And then that's never really explained. And then eventually you find out that guy came back to life. So by the end of the episode, you are meant to take at face value the whole vampire thing. You are meant to understand that these people probably were supernatural in some form. At least that's what I got by the end of the episode. I don't know if there's something I'm missing. But the guy does come back from the dead, right? It's not another guy.
Yeah.
It is him. So, you know, he does. We saw him burn up.
Oh, yeah.
Now here he is, totally fine and alive and well and so on. So
what's the From Dusk Till Dawn quote? Psychos don't explode when sunlight hits them. I don't care how crazy they are.
Right, exactly. Yes, that's actually my favorite line from that movie.
You were talking about the love interest aspect, and it very much fits into the cop on the edge sleeps with the woman who's a part of his investigation trope, which I think works for a single episode.
Sure.
In concept, mostly because Mulder is just at rock bottom right now and kind of in a self-destructive mood to a degree. So it sort of fits his mental status at the time. As far as how she fits into the plot, I think it gets a little too convoluted at one point because they make it a point to hammer home over and over and over again that it's a trinity. It's a trinity. These are the Trinity killers. There's always three: the Father, the Son, and the Unholy Spirit. But clearly they're not hunting her to kill her. They're hunting her to make them one of them, which would bust up the Trinity.
Right, exactly. That part's, and it makes the story confusing because it took me a minute to even figure out, because when the episode opens, it opens with a murder where you see clearly that one of these vampires, one of these killers is a woman that seduces the man, and then they murder him. And so, to be perfectly honest, when Mulder first goes to that club, I thought that was her.
Yeah.
You know, and I thought that Mulder knew that or suspected that or something, right? So when he first walks into her house and they start talking, I didn't know what they were talking about. Because I was like, wait a minute, isn't she the killer? Isn't this the same woman? Because you barely see her. You know, you kind of see her in the shadows at the opening of the episode. You don't really get a very good look at her. And then, so I just assumed it was her. So it wasn't until the end that I said, oh, so there's another woman. So there's another what? Like the whole thing about them going after her because they want to convert her. I think it's more that what is he, the son?
Yeah,
That's who it is, right? The one that dies and comes back is the son,
yeah,
right? So he's like he seems to be really obsessed with her.
yeah.
That's the impression like he's like in love with her. He wants to bring her into the fold. So you're right that they would break up the Trinity, but then again, the Trinity is just for the intents and purposes. The episode's called Three because it is about a trinity of killers. But I don't know that they necessarily have to operate as a trinity, or do they say that at any point that that's how they have to operate?
They don't specifically say that, but since they refer to themselves as Father, Son, and Unholy Spirit, they've kind of positioned themselves that way anyway. I think, just to play armchair writer here for a minute, there's one of two ways they could have taken that and still make it work. One would be to eliminate the other female character, have Kristen be the third in the Trinity, but having doubts about continuing to do what they've been doing, which she kind of seems like she's already a half vampire anyway, like she's teetering on the brink and doesn't want to go full all the way. But it would simplify things if you eliminated the other female who, along with the father, really doesn't have any sort of personality in the episode aside from looking menacing anyway. I
Right.
think it would simplify things if you removed that character and then just made Kristen the unholy spirit, and now having doubts about the lifestyle that she's leading. Or you could flip it around and actually give dialogue sequences to the Father and the unholy spirit with the Son about whether or not they should be bringing a fourth person into the fold. Like
Right.
you either had to cut one character out or actually make the other two actual characters. And since they just kind of went down the middle of the road, it makes it confusing when you're first watching it. I'm used to it now because I've seen the episode a few times, but even on my second and maybe even third viewing of it, mentally I had always remembered Kristen as being the third of the three and not an additional person on top of that. But yeah, it's a little too convoluted for its own good on that front.
Yeah, and I think that might be because that might even be you said like playing armchair writer. This was written uh, Glenn Morgan and James Wong, but they did basically they did a rewrite of Chris Rubenthal coming in with the story,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe this is a casualty of the rewrite.
Could be.
You know, like maybe they felt that they decided that the character of Kristen should be more sympathetic. And so if you actually made the character of Kristen the unholy spirit and actually made her a killer, that would remove the sympathy aspect. Whereas if you make her somebody who's seduced by the lifestyle but hasn't, they make a real point of like she has not yet taken a life.
Right.
They really highlight that. So that no, this is not a killer. This is just somebody who's like into it. She's into the lifestyle. And I think that might be a rewrite thing. That might be like them saying, well, you know, maybe it makes more sense. That might have even been something later in production, even once it was decided that they were going to cast Duchovny's real life, partner in the role, and they decided that they're going to make Mulder get, romantically involved with this character. That hammered it home even more. Like, we can't have Mulder get romantically involved with a villain. She has to sort of be heroic. And again, this is just me speculating about like why things got so messy. But I do think that they make it needlessly confusing because you go from the club, Mulder following. I assumed that he was following Kristen again, and it wasn't Kristen. I mean, I guess when he goes to that restaurant that's closed, and there's that dude who's having his good time, right? And then it turns out that it was consensual. You know, when he pulls the peeping tom routine, and then the guy comes out of the red. That whole sequence, again, I thought that was Kristen.
Well,
But
it was.
it was, but so wait, she's there. She leaves. Like I don't get
Yeah.
it. Like okay. So there you go. So now what happened there? Because
Yeah, you get him following them to the Raw restaurant,
right.
and standing on the crates outside the window and peeping in like a little kid.
Like Dirty Harry, basically.
Yeah, watching her, I guess, lick raspberry sauce off of his chest.
Right, yes.
Then the dude catches him, goes outside, and throws him down the steps.
Right,
and
beats the
comes
shit
back
out of him,
in, and he's walking around the kitchen yelling Kristen's name while eating strawberries. But now she's all of a sudden gone, but the other vampires are actually there now. See, it's convoluted, and you're right, it does smack of something getting lost in translation and a rewrite.
Yeah, because see, if Kristen were the unholy spirit, then that scene would make total sense. Because then the other two would be there. They would have been hiding, much like the son is at the end saying, "I was waiting for you to finish." So it would have been basically the same. They were waiting. They were in hiding, until the manager of the raw restaurant would finish, and then they could go in and do what they need to do, and then it would make total sense. But because there's because she's external to it, then it's like, where did she go? Or is she there while they do that? And then she just watches them do that and she's fine with it. And she goes, it just doesn't really make sense. Because very clearly when, the father comes in and, beats the crap out of the guy. And then when the woman comes in and screams, I thought the woman was Kristen. I assumed that. It's a quick shot. You barely see her. She's screaming, and so I'm like, oh yeah, Kristen, this is she's the one, and that makes total sense. But then you have that confusing scene, and exactly. It was definitely a rewrite problem.
Yeah,
I think it seems like something that you fuck up when you rewrite it. You realize you have a good set piece. You need that scene. You need the guy from the restaurant getting murdered. You need all of that. But you've added this new element. You've changed one of the characters. How do you make the scene work? And it's like, fuck it. The scene's there. It doesn't matter.
It's overcomplicated when it doesn't need to be.
But basically, I guess that's basically the problem. I guess that what they have an interesting story, but it got kind of messed up in the rewrite. And then at the end, we are meant to understand that they really are vampires.
Mm-hmm.
And Kristen sacrifices herself at the end.
Yes.
That's a good tragic ending for it's a good way to resolve the love story aspect where Mulder now gets to mope, because he was falling for this woman, and now he gets to mope. He's lost yet another woman in his life, and so but it's good for the whole hard-boiled cop on the edge sort of trope. Aspect of the episode that you were talking about. Usually those noir stories tend to have tragic endings. Usually the guy loses the girl. Whether it's Chinatown or, whether he loses the girl because the girl gets killed, or whether he has to let go of her like Humphrey Bogart in Casablanca. But the point is, the hard-boiled dude does not get to keep the girl. That's the way it works. Yeah. Right? So that's fine too. That works well. But I'm left with questions because the son came back from the dead after getting roasted by
Yes.
He came back from the dead. What's to stop him from coming back again?
Well,
because it's fire. Is that it?
No, they get convoluted again at the end.
Okay.
She can only fully become a vampire by drinking the blood of a believer and then killing them. So her cop-out way of killing the other three vampires is, she stabbed the one in the bedroom a bunch of times. He's going to be laying there for a while. The unholy spirit in the garage got the coat rack peg through her head.
Yeah, I think it's her head. Yeah.
So she's not getting up for a while, and then Johnny, the son, is tied up to that pillar by Mulder with that extension cord. And she's standing there in front of him. She's dumped gasoline all over the house, and he says, if you like that, we're just going to come back. You can't kill us. You're not one of us. Only another vampire can kill a vampire, is apparently the rule. And she reaches back and tastes some of her own blood because she's a believer. She knows it's true. And then she says the life that she's going to take to complete the ritual is her own. So she's drinking her own blood and killing herself and then killing the other three in the process. So that's the neat little bow that they come up with at the end, which seems like a bit of a cop out. What if it doesn't work? You're going to be dead. You're not going to know if they come back. Obviously, it did work, but still, yeah, it's a bit of a cop out.
Yeah, it's definitely a cop out. And see, I didn't get any of that. I accept your explanation, which
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense, which makes total sense, and you're right. But again, yeah, this is extremely convoluted. It's just this thing where you have to make all these leaps and start putting things together, and because even that, when she licks her hand and goes like, I've tasted the blood of a believer, and it took me a minute to even understand what she meant.
Yeah.
You know, and now that you've clarified it, I'm like, oh right, yeah, I guess that's what she meant when she said that. Okay. Well, and he's like, you haven't taken a life. I will. I'll take my own. He's like, no, no. And I guess him screaming no, no, no is enough, should be enough for confirmation for her
Yeah.
that she's doing the right thing, because he wouldn't lose his shit if he had the certainty that he's going to come back.
You can tell whether it was Morgan and Wong or the original writer that someone sat down and took the time to figure out exactly what they wanted the rules to be for the vampires.
Right.
And then there's even that weird little aside with the blood loaf that's in the oven, which if you take it at face value, you figure like, oh, she just baked a dessert for herself filled with blood.
Yeah.
But then
Yeah.
Mulder has that throwaway line about it being a like some sort of weird little protection ritual against vampires from old European beliefs. So it's like someone took the time to sit down and work all this stuff out, and then whether they didn't clarify it enough in the writing originally or it got muddled in the rewrite, it just got all mangled up. And well, probably unless you've seen it multiple times, it's really confusing.
Yeah, it's very confusing because, and what you're saying is true. I mean, it's true that when you're writing a fantastical story, whatever it is, whether you're talking about like a mythological gothic horror or whether you're talking about science fiction, whatever it is that you're dealing in fantasy, you're dealing in fiction, and you have rules. And in any good piece of writing, those, you establish the rules, and as long as you follow those rules, then suspension of disbelief is maintained, and the reader or the viewer will be able to follow because they will be aware of the rules, and they will know you're not breaking the rules. So it's all good, right? Because you can accept anything. That's the whole point. Like if it's my vampire story, then guess what? This is going to be my rule, you know. If it's my werewolf story, in my version, you don't need a silver bullet. You know, like in An American Werewolf in London, you don't need a silver bullet to kill the werewolf there. Regular bullets will do just fine. So it's the same in any case. Because like, this is my vampire story, so in my vampire story, no, sun doesn't kill them or whatever. Okay, it's like Twilight, whatever you want to do, right? But you need to establish those rules. Now here's the problem. See, when you have too many rules, or when you have too much, when it's a little bit too much, I mean, this isn't a movie. This is a 45-minute short subject. This is something that, you need to tell this story, and you need to tell it coherently and, satisfyingly in 45 minutes. And it's perfectly acceptable that you have rules. But I mean, we've seen them do this, like whether it's a guy who can stretch and eats livers, and they give us enough that we know we get it. That's Tombs, right? But here, okay, so you have this vampire mythology which has its own kind of complex ruling. The whole thing with the bread, the whole, like, everything that you just said about how only a vampire can kill another vampire, only, all of that. You can't give it to us as the story goes. You need to establish it sort of up front.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't mean to just have this exposition dump at the front, but you need to establish it in a way that feels organic. And you can't just throw this thing in there, in the third act.
Yeah.
And expect us to be able to follow it when you haven't given us anything else. So like the whole thing with the bread, like I didn't even realize. Okay, so when he sees that bread and he opens it up, in my head, because he'd come from the restaurant where there was this thing of raspberry sauce,
Yeah.
and I'm like, what is this? Like a raspberry pound cake? Like I didn't even think it was important. I didn't even think it mattered, or even if it was a bread with a bunch of blood in it, or it's not something that even registered, right, as being important. And then for him to then have that throwaway, like she's like, how did you know? I knew because of the bread. And then he gives us that whole explanation, and you go, oh. But see, in my head, I'm still thinking that Kristen is the killer. I don't
Yeah.
realize. I'm still thinking that this is the same woman from the beginning of the episode, the same woman from the kitchen when they killed the guy at the restaurant. I'm still thinking she's the killer. So I'm like, protect herself from what? From the cops? And when he says like they're coming for you, does he mean the police? Because you hear sirens in the distance. I'm like, what is he talking about? And when he says like I'm going to protect you, does he mean like, okay, I'm going to stop the police from killing you? Like that's why that whole thing is just very confusing. And whereas if you'd had the story, let's say Kristen is the killer, you could have had Mulder get involved with her.
Mm-hmm.
She's a seductive figure. She's a beautiful woman. Meets her at a club. There's something very intriguing about her beliefs and her lifestyle, and to even have Mulder, even for a second, start to become seduced by that lifestyle even, is a compelling place to take the story. Maybe they don't want to take this particular story there. Maybe they don't want Mulder to go there. But it wouldn't be, it would even make sense for everything that you were saying about him, like him fitting the hard-boiled cop on the edge mold, the fact that he's just lost Scully. He's kind of he's in a dark place right now. And so for him to even contemplate briefly going to the dark side, as they say, would make sense. It would make sense for the character.
Yeah, I agree. Instead, we get on that front, we get one of Duchovny's classic ad libs. So, don't you want to live forever? Not if drawstring pants come back into style. That, along with the coroner going, "Oh, this is an old coroner's trick. I can pull a quarter out of your ear."
Yeah, there's a lot of good lines. The episode overall, even if it doesn't quite hold together, I think the parts that work well.
Mm-hmm.
You have, the whole setup is fine. That's why things start to fall apart after the guy burns up, and when the investigation deepens, that's when things start to fall apart. But I always like let's say the first half of the episode kind of holds together, and it's intriguing, and you wonder where it's all going. So that's fine. And you have some really good scenes. The scene at the club is atmospheric. There is a seductiveness to it. Clearly, Duchovny and this actress, they have good chemistry, I guess, on screen and off. It's fine. All of that's fine. It's just the curse of the rewrites, the rewrite syndrome, or whatever we want to call it. But
I agree. I find that, well, I think she's really good, and I like the guy who plays the son. I think he's really good in all of his sequences. I think the reason why I specifically wanted to talk about this episode is not because it's a favorite. The vampire aspect is intriguing, but I mostly find it interesting just from Mulder's psyche in the wake of Scully's disappearance. Just the place that he finds himself at, and the overall mood and tone of the episode in regards to that.
I suppose if Scully had been around, maybe he wouldn't have gotten involved.
Probably
romantically,
not.
Because the investigation would have been handled in a completely different way.
Mm-hmm.
So it just would have been a different thing. And so we see that Mulder is he's in a vulnerable place right now.
Yeah.
And the episode is able to play that off well. And I think that all his actions, his attitude, all of it is believable because of that context. So that's fine. Nothing is out of character for Mulder. He does stay in character. It's not that what he does doesn't really make sense. It does make sense given where he is at that moment.
One other interesting thing is this is an actual closed case. It's done.
Oh, you're right. You're right.
The killers are dead. There's no open ending thing. It's over. It's an actual closed X-file.
Yeah, and it might even be the first one where you can really say that.
Yeah, I think it might be.
Yeah.
How many episodes are we in now?
Well, yeah. This is like what? Like we're about 30 episodes into the show. Yeah. We're, about 7 episodes into the second season. You're right. Well, I guess you could say that the Toombs case was closed because Toombs is dead, and that's done.
Yeah. There's a couple, but not very many.
There's a couple here and there, but most of them still have a thing hanging on there. But yeah, I mean, as far as we're concerned, that cult of vampires that has been, terrorizing people in California, it's over. They're all toast.
We'll rise up. You can't kill us. You're not one of us.
But I will be. I'm tasting the blood of a believer.
But you haven't taken a life.
I'll take mine.
Don't do that. Don't do that! No!
And that is that. I hope you enjoyed our discussion. And if you did enjoy it, there are many ways you can support the podcast, which is available on Anchor FM, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. You can subscribe. You can rate and or review it, depending on what platform you're enjoying it on. And of course, you can share. Spread the word on social media. Please do any or all of these things. Every little bit helps. Look for the Erix Antoine Network on Facebook or on YouTube. You can also follow me on Twitter at ErixAntoineNet and check out my film reviews on Letterboxd. You should also check out Daniel Baldwin's website, theschlocketeer.com, and follow him on Twitter at Daniel W. Baldwin. I'm Erix Antoine, and I'll be back in a few days when Daniel and I will be discussing Gillian Anderson's, and by extension Scully's, return to the X-Files, the momentous episode, One Breath. I hope you'll join us. And until then, please remember that the truth is out there. See you next time.